Hello, I'm here during the lunch rush with Janice, who owns her own food truck.
Best cheesesteaks in town.
Janice traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for her food truck business. We're here where she needs us most.
They sure are.
We make it so easy for her to save, with customised coverage that grows with her business. Sorry, I just get so emotional talking about saving folks money.
Not this onion I'm chopping?
It's just so beautiful. Oh yeah, no, it's the onion.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. It feels good to Geico.
Hello and welcome back to the Dunbar End podcast here on Hibs Observer's YouTube channel. I'm Jack Harris, joined as ever by Patrick McPartland, Hibs Observer editor. I've been working on a piece for doing the squad depth for Hibs going into the 2026-2027 season after Patrick did a piece talking about Hibs' retained list. So between the two of us, I think we've got quite a good idea of what David Gray's squad looks like going into next season. I think, well, for now, as it stands, I think I said about 7 times in the piece. Just couldn't think of another phrase for it, but for now is a good one. So we'll maybe just go through it in order. Let's start with the defence. I sort of asked the question.
Sorry, we're just skipping over the goalkeepers, are we? Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the goalkeepers?
Yes, from the point of view that you can say probably barring anything unexpected for the first season in a while, Hibs don't really need to do any surgery there. They've got an established number one. They've got a backup who is equally adept at stepping in as the number one or the first choice. And they've got a couple of younger keepers who presumably can step up as the third choice for the European games or indeed if needed throughout the season. And it's quite a nice position to be in. This is the benefits of kind of succession planning and having a kind of clear defined route in terms of recruitment. So just wanted to say that. Goalkeeper's done and dusted. Nothing to go on there.
Somebody's been reading my article. If only somebody had said that on the Hibs Observer's website no fewer than 24 hours ago. We'll move on to the defenders now. So the question I posed in the article was, I mean, obviously we don't know the exact diagnosis of Rocky Bashiri's injury, but David Gray speculated in a press conference that he thought it was maybe an Achilles problem. Grant Hanley was off. He's assured Steve Clark that I think he's fit to go to the World Cup and those 2 friendly games coming up as well. But Minash Garananga going back to Copenhagen after his loan spell at Hibs, do you think there's going to be some need for, I mean, you say surgery, do you think there's need for reinforcement in the backline?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even if you take Rocky Bashiri's injury out of the equation, there were still times last season where Jordan Abita was having to fill in as a left-sided centre-half. Now he plays there for Uganda at national team level. He is a decent option there. I don't really think he's let Hibs down when he's played there, but it does feel a bit kind of square peg and round hole. And when you look at his crossing ability, you look at what he can bring to that left wing-back role, to me it just makes sense to try and keep him as an option on that left flank, which would then mean you would need bodies in defence. And we saw that in the first half of the season. They brought Zach Mitchell in. He didn't play very much, but I think he made two appearances.
What was the second?
Came on as a sub against Kilmarnock in January.
Right.
And
I just remember the Dundee United game at Tannadice. I thought that was his only one, but
I think it was his only start. And then
really well
Kilmarnock
in that game.
And so that's 2 centre-backs who've come in on loan who've played, 2 games each, obviously for different reasons. For Mitchell, it was a case of not being able to really force his way into the starting lineup. Garanang obviously had his injury issues. But I think you look at that defence and you say, well, Warren O'Hora is probably going to start on the right of that back 3, assuming that David Gray does stick with it. And, I think we've got no reason at the moment to believe that he will deviate from that just yet. So you'd have Warren O'Hora starting on the right of that back 3. You'd then have, assuming he gets through the World Cup unscathed, Grant Hanley in the middle of that back 3, and then Jack Iredale on the left. But with Rocky Bashiri injured, and as you say, David Gray mentioned it looked like an Achilles problem, that potentially could be a long spell on the sidelines. You would need somebody else to come in to cover Rocky. You would also need, I think, another one, because we saw Grant Hanley, his injuries this season. He's, I think, 34 now, and red cards aside, if you're not going to be able to rely on him for a full season, and there's going to be some games where you're going to want a different blend in your defence depending on the forwards you're coming up against, the formations, things like that, then there's probably an argument for needing at least 2 bodies in the back line. And I think Hibs do have the players to kind of get by at the moment, but I don't think you want to be in that kind of area going into the start of a season. You want to say we've got a number of players who can play here. Like, yes, Jordan Abita can play there in an emergency. Kanayo Megwa can play there in an emergency. But, you would want to have, I think, ideally, if you're playing a back three, you probably need 5 to choose from. So at any one time, you've got 3 starting and 2 sort of as backup, or with Rocky Bashiri out, just 1. But I think it's been a bit of a problem for Hibs this season just past. Like the 24-25, you had sort of lastly at the end of the sort of second half of the season, you had O'Hora, Rocky, and Iredale, or you had Miller.
I was going to mention Lewis Miller being somebody that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Hibs really replaced. Just in terms of that, what could be a right back, but could also come in for that right centre back position as well.
Yeah, and obviously as we remember, started the season, started the second half of the season playing right wing back before kind of being shifted back into that right centre back role. And I think, it was himself, it was Kurevic, it was Gale, it was Triantis that Hibs didn't really properly replace. And I think, at the moment between Felix Paslak and O'Hora, you've got 2 players there who are kind of combining what Miller was doing in one. O'Hora's not going to have those sort of marauding runs up the wing that Miller had, but he's also good cover for when Paslak does it. And Paslak does things that, for example, Chris Cadden wouldn't do at right wing back, because he's much more of a kind of an attacking outlet. So I think you look at the squad as it stands with the sort of 25 players in there, and there's definitely players who can play different positions. We know that David Gray likes his dual position players, but I think there were a few times this season where, for instance, Jamie McGrath having to play left wing back, Abita having to play centre back maybe more than he would have wanted. We saw Abita playing, I think, centrally the 24-25 season in midfield. So that kind of thing tells you that there is a need for bodies coming through there. Whether or not, sort of, for example, Joseph McGrath might be an option, even as a sort of temporary measure, I suppose. That remains to be seen. He's not had a lot of first team football. He's had that loan stint with Stranraer, and by all accounts done quite well on that temporary stint. But it's whether or not David Gray would be happy to sort of throw him into first team football.
Because he's always talked about sort of being cautious of that. And I look back to the under-19s League Cup final, and I think McGrath, before he came off injured, was fantastic. But it is a significant step up to make from sort of the youth levels into being either a starting centre back or a sort of coming off the bench centre back at senior level. That's a big step, not necessarily one he couldn't take, but it does feel like you need another sort of veteran experienced option to come into the squad too. Yeah, and I think we saw that with Gray's comments about Owen Elding this week, that they didn't want to put too much pressure on him as a young man, and he's not that much older than Joe McGrath. So I think there is understandably a level of wanting to kind of protect players and not wanting to sort of put too much expectation on them too quickly. In Elding's case, they didn't put too much expectation on him, and he kind of thrived on that because, as Gray was saying, he's probably contributed more than they were expecting him to. So there's always the possibility that happens. There's always the possibility that a player kind of exceeds expectations, if you like, but it's an awfully big risk to take. And as we've seen, I don't think David Gray is a man who likes to take a lot of unnecessary risks. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you go back to talking about O'Hora and Paslak. I mean, that's an interesting one. I was trying to think back. I think it was the 0-0 draw at Fir Park, where I think you saw that combination. I may be talking complete nonsense, but I think Paslak and O'Hora both started that game. And I think what you saw from O'Hora was almost that sort of Miller-esque drive forward. I think he played a few good balls up the right flank through to the midfield and sort of had that little bit of aggression. I mean, it has aggression as a centre-back, definitely, that sort of commanding presence at the back, but did have that push forward. And I think Paslak complemented that quite well. Also with the sort of central centre-back. Was it Rocky or Hanley? Whoever it was providing quite good cover there too. Yeah, I mean, different games will call for sort of different kind of systems, if you like, even within the kind of rough 3-5-2 shape. I mean, Gray has said on several occasions that it's not so much about the formation or who plays where, it's about who does what. And we've seen with Paslak and those runs up the right flank, we've seen the right-sided central midfielder, usually Miguel Chaiwa, kind of dropping into that space as well, almost to kind of create a back four at times. So, I mean, there's fluidity, there's flexibility, but I think
you don't want to be in David Gray's position. You don't want to be relying on kind of 2.5 centre backs and then sort of squeezing other guys in there because they can play there in an emergency. You would like it to be the case that if it comes to it, you've got somebody who can fill in there if required, but you don't want to be relying on them and saying, well, I'm going to take you out of your natural position and put you here for 7 or 8 games this season, because you want that to be like an unforeseen, we'll make do and mend, if you like, rather than sort of saying, well, this is a viable option.
Yeah, sort of as it was when Jamie McGrath dropped back to left wing back. It was
and that was a couple of games, was it? Something like that.
Something like that, 2 or 3, I think.
That's absolutely fine. Same as when you've got some games where Hibs have moved to back 4 and it's maybe looked like an unconventional quartet. It's fine as a sort of sticking plaster. It's fine as a temporary measure, but I suppose in short, you wouldn't want to be going into this season saying Jordan Abita is one of our sort of, primary options at centre back. Absolutely not a problem with playing him there. He's fine there. But I think you lose what he would provide on the flank. You sort of lose that, whether he's sort of providing competition for Nicky Cadden or, whether it's just, the other way around, depending on who they're playing against, depending on if it's, a more kind of 5-3-2 rather than 3-5-2.
Yeah, it's good to have the option, but their sort of best strengths lie elsewhere. I mean, McGrath, when he was at left wing back, did a very good job there, but you did feel that you missed something in the midfield without him there. So I think it's horses for courses. It's a great thing to have, but you don't want to be relying on that. And
you could equally argue the same when Hibs tried Josh Mulligan at right wing back a few times last season. Didn't really look like his most natural position, and Hibs definitely missed him in midfield as they did in the second half of the season.
So it works when it has to, but there are better results.
Exactly, yeah. You don't want to be relying on it. You don't want that to be your kind of go-to shape, your go-to system. So I think it's fine to have players who can fill in an emergency, but you don't want that to be your kind of starting approach, basically.
Yeah, well, interesting that we mentioned 2 midfielders in McGrath and Mulligan. So we'll maybe move.
That was the segue. Yeah.
Move up the pitch. Couple of players leaving. A couple of players have been on loan at Hibs. So Dan Barlas has been at Hibs for the season. Kai Andrews been there since January. I think joined on deadline day, if not just slightly before. Hibs on their retained list have confirmed that both will go back to their parent clubs. Now, Barlas is an interesting one. So going back to Middlesbrough, but his contract is expiring. I know that there was talk earlier on in the season, I think towards the end of March, start of April, that Hibs might be interested in signing Barlas on a permanent deal. Do you still see that as being a tangible idea, and is it something you would support?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think you see on social media like fans really are split about this one. And on the one hand, you look at it and say, here's an experienced midfielder who's had plenty of games in the English Championship and League One in England. We've seen what he can do with the ball. But at the same time, you think we've not really seen a lot more from him. I mean, some of those diagonals that he hits are fantastic, but that's kind of been it for me. And there's been some games where he's been really, really influential. He's been really effective, but it's against a certain type of team and a team that plays in a certain type of way. And I think there's been other games where he's been quite peripheral, if I'm honest. And I think it was quite telling for me that there were games towards the end of the season, I think probably in the post-split fixtures, where he started on the bench and Joe Newell came in. And I just felt that might be a little bit of David Gray maybe looking at what he needs in his midfield and thinking, I need a bit more bite in there. I mean, Joe Newell's got has his detractors, but I think he's maybe he's got a bit more aggression than Barlasser perhaps. And I think that might have been why he opted to go with Newell on some occasions, just for that, the magnitude of the games. And, not to kind of take anything away from Barlasser, but it's like we've been saying, you need different players for different types of games. I mean, you say don't change a winning team, which is fine. But just because you've beaten one team doesn't mean you're going to be able to beat the next team, because they might play a totally different style of football. They might have different threats. It might be a different shape. So I think, you have to be adaptable. You have to be flexible. And you have to say, well, this is the best sort of starting 11 that I can put out that gives us the best chance of winning this game. And I just think I didn't really see an awful lot of difference between Newell and Barlasser at times in terms of what they were bringing to the team sort of this season just past. But it did feel quite significant that Newell was coming in for those games post-split. Now, that could be nothing. I could be reading into something that isn't there. I could be putting 2 and 2 together, getting 5. But I just wondered whether that was, maybe a little bit of a signal that perhaps, perhaps David Gray changed his mind. Perhaps there was something else going on there. I mean, we saw on a couple of occasions Barlasser did adopt a bit more of a kind of aggressive approach. There was that, what was the goal that struck Motherwell? I think we saw elements of it in the 3-1 win at Falkirk.
Yeah, there have been shades of it, definitely.
But if we're counting them on one hand, and that's not great. And I think when you consider how many times Hibs looked a little bit kind of light in midfield, too many games where they didn't really show themselves at their best in midfield. They maybe lost the midfield battle. And it boils down to trying to replace Nectar Triantis and it being very difficult to find a like-for-like replacement.
Well, I mean,
trying to find a combination that works. And I said in the pod, I think it was probably last week, I talked about a midfield of Mulligan, McGran and Chaiwa being a good starting point. That's not to say that should be the only midfield. There needs to be...
on social media. Sorry, I did clip that.
You did clip that.
Clips do, by their very nature, take things out of context. I think you did then go on and say...
Just paint a target on my chest.
Points of a minute later.
But no, I mean, I should have clarified at the time, but definitely there is a requirement for kind of a bit of a kind of number 6, a destroyer who can just come in for certain games and just sort of screen the back 4, well, the back 3 in Hibs' case, and just sort of do a little bit, because Chai was quite good at that, but he's just not. He's not quite ready for that sort of disciplined role yet.
He's still young.
He's still young. He's still got the sort of headless chicken tendencies at times, and I think this is going to sound strange, but he's too energetic. I think if you tried to play him as a number 6, if you tried to play him as a number 6, he'd just be, right, I'm gonna go and close that boy down on the right flank. I'm gonna go and like into the centre circle.
Whereas I think Barlasser has that discipline, he has that experience, but he just we've spoken about this a few times. It's like when Triantis left, rather than replace him with one player, because that's a difficult thing to do, you look at trying to replace him with different midfield options. So you get different elements in, let's say, a midfield of Josh Mulligan, Miguel Chaiwa, Dan Barlasser, but I just think against some team, and you say a sort of certain type of opposition, he's been good. It's when he sort of has the time to do what he does well. And you've noticed a good few times this season, when the sort of the top 6 teams put him under pressure, it feels like there's a sort of lacking of presence in the midfield somewhere. And for me, I think it's one of those signings where, should it be a permanent sign, like, it's great if you can have. But just thinking, even with an expiring contract, and probably, I mean, it's not unlikely that some English teams will be interested in acquiring his services. I think the wage battle that you're going to end up in for that, you want to make sure you get good bang for your buck. And I don't think it's a nice to have signing is necessarily the right thing to do if it's going to cost.
You can't have, not necessarily saying he's a luxury signing. You can't have luxury signings. You can't have players who are suitable for maybe a quarter of your games all season. I think it comes down to, could the money you'd be spending on Barlasser be better spent somewhere else? I think it probably could.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing.
We've also got the player's sort of personal situation to take into account. It just might not work for him up here. He might want to, I think, is he 29, 30, something like that. So he maybe feels he's got a few years left. He might reckon he can get he can get a gig at one of the, I don't know, maybe like a top League One side that's pushing for promotion, maybe a championship team. Because I think when you look at what Middlesbrough did last season, how well they were going when his sort of loan moves to Hibs was sanctioned, then you could understand why he wasn't getting in the squad. But he'll have a reputation down there. He's obviously come from the Newcastle Academy, so he's got that reputation. He's got that kind of, he's got that in the bank, if you like. And I just think, perhaps if the game is sort of slightly less frenetic down there, then maybe it suits him better, and maybe he thinks actually that's more what I want to be playing in which case there's not a debate to be had, because it's not going to be, it's not something he wants to do. But I think I just think it would be, I wouldn't really see the point in having like Newell and Barlasser in the same team. I think also Hibs were happy to let Dylan Levitt leave in January, because I think he was probably a little bit too similar to Barlasser. I just think it's we go back to the Triantis thing. You're not going to find players like Triantis growing on trees. You're not just going to be able to walk into any kind of English Premier League academy and say, yeah, we'll take that one. Just that sort of big physical presence in the middle of the park. Like Killian Phillips is a good example, as like another player who just has that sort of height and that dig in midfield.
Yeah.
I think we've seen seen in some games that St Mirren have played Hibs where he has kind of dominated the midfield. He's been part of the reason why Hibs have maybe struggled in the middle of the park. So it's it is just that it's that profile of having a kind of tall, rangy midfielder who's happy carrying the ball, happy getting stuck in, protecting the defence. And Hibs just don't really have anyone like that. Like we are saying, Chaiba's not disciplined enough. There's nobody else in that team who can really kind of do that. And that's that for me. Is, you need to have a number 6 in there who is capable of doing that, and that maybe isn't going to start every game, isn't going to play in every game, but can be brought in for certain games or can be brought on as a sub.
Yeah, you've got the option,
because that's the other thing is we saw a number of times. I've lost count actually of how many times Hibs just failed to see games out, and there were changes made, but they didn't feel like the right ones. And if you just had a sort of 6'3" destroyer to come on and just say, right, go and protect the defence, just mop everything up, clear loose balls, that sort of thing, then that gives you a good chance of holding on to what you've got rather than kind of losing it.
I mean, there've been more than one occasion this past season where I've been sat either in the stands as a supporter or in the press box with you, and you look at it and you go, Hibs are losing the midfield battle here, but I don't actually know who they bring on to fix that. And I think that comes down to depth again, comes down to having different options, and having that option would be great. I think it will look different with Josh Mulligan being back as well. Obviously, he's had a couple of games coming off the bench after that sort of long-term ankle injury sustained at Dunfermline. So that will almost, I can't remember the player before we talked about as being a sort of almost feeling like a new signing, but it will in some ways. I just think if you get Mulligan back in and then have a sort of number 6 option as well, that's going to create a very well-rounded midfield. And
the other problem that you've got is that signings have been made for the midfield who, for whatever reason, just haven't worked. So Alassane Mane, came in with, there was probably not too much fanfare. There was a fair amount of fanfare, just, that's going to happen when you're talking about someone who's been in the famed Barcelona Academy. We have to say famed Barcelona Academy. I can't just say Barcelona Academy.
Mighty La Masia,
Barcelona Academy. And, again, a player who's looked good in flashes, but, I mean, no league appearances beyond a 10-minute substitute kind of cameo in the first game of the seaon. I mean,
the last game was the League Cup against Livingston.
It was, and you know what? He played well that game. He sort of, I think he was in the midfield with, I want to say, Miguel Chaiwa to begin with. Then that was Chaiwa's first game.
I think you're right. Yeah, it's Chaiwa and Cliche was up front, so I think they both got some sort of first, not necessarily first starts, but at least decent minutes.
Yeah, and didn't look bad there. But I think there's been times where it's the same with other players where it's maybe he's not doing what's required, or if he's just not kind of settled into Scottish football, it's maybe like a bit more physical. It's not every player is going to settle. Not every player is going to fit into how Hibs want to play. It comes down to Malky Mackay talking about trying to get 7 out of every 10 signings correct. There are going to be some misses, and you're aiming to have more hits than you are misses. And I think Hibs were probably prepared to let Manny go last summer if there'd been interest, and it was the right move for the player and the club. And I would suspect it would probably be a similar story this summer as well, that if there is interest, and there was interest last summer, if there's interest and it works, then I think probably best for all parties that he moves on, because he's not, as things stand, he's not going to be bothering the first team squad. He's not going to be getting into match day squads. You bring in Kai Andrews on loan, you bring in Dan Barlasser on loan, they're both getting on the bench ahead of him. You've got Jacob McIntyre's looks like he's going to be in the first team squad next season. And that's another player who, will be battling for those kind of central midfield roles. And you look at the first team squad, there are a lot of central midfielders in there, a lot of very similar central midfielders.
Yeah.
And
it's not going to be easy to break your way into.
It's not, but I mean, it's also an issue that Hibs have, is that, and they had this a few years back, where they've got too many central midfielders who are too similar. And I think, that has to be one of the things in terms of recruitment is, and you don't want to be seeing every window Hibs having to sign sort of 5, 6, 7 players and get rid of 3 or 4. Obviously there's going to be some movement, but ideally you want to be in a position where you can say, right, we only need to bring in 1 or 2 this window. And that's all we need to do, because we've got, players coming through from the academy. We've got players who can cover those positions. And so I think it's going to be an interesting one in central midfield, because, as you say, they've lost Andrews and Barlasser, but still got a lot of midfielders there quite similar in profile for me. And I think, they do need that number 6 I mean, there has been interest in Mulligan and Chaiwa as well, and we'll wait and see if that kind of rears its head again. But it does feel a bit like, the 6 is sort of missing piece at the moment. Potentially another kind of creative midfielder, just to kind of take some of the pressure off McGrath, perhaps. But I mean, I think you can get creativity from your wide players, potentially from your forwards as well, depending on their profiles.
Yeah.
Though I think if you are going to be prioritizing anything in midfield, it's got to be that sort of number 6, that defensive-minded player who's just there to kick and head everything that moves and some things that don't.
Well, the forwards are an interesting case in itself because obviously Dane Scarlett, I was about to say Kai Andrews, we were just talking about him in midfield. Dane Scarlett is a striker going back to Tottenham, and then sort of the revolving door of loan deals at Thibaut Clichy coming back from his spell at Randers FC. Clichy, I think, I want to say it was 2 starts he made towards the end of Randers' campaign. I think he eventually sort of gets the goal that sort of nearly gives them the win in their either penultimate or final game. I think it was their penultimate game, because then they lost 5-0 to Copenhagen. But ends up sort of getting his goal on one of his starts. And you could see that, I spoke to Rasmus Bertelsen, the Randers manager, quite a while ago, and you could see Clichy starting to do the things he was looking for, starting to establish his place in the team. Doesn't look like they're going to exercise that buyout option. Don't know. You never know these things. You never know what could happen in terms of Randers' own incomings or outgoings. But by all accounts, Clichy will be back at Easter Road. Now, we've said on more than one occasion this season that it almost feels like he was intended to be the replacement for Martin Boyle when he left at the end of this season. Martin Boyle's done the sort of Grandpa Simpson, and he's sort of right back in, hat on the door, and then he's back in for another year. Do you think that creates a bit of an issue for Thibaut almost? Not does he have a place in the team? How does he get a place in the team? And how does David Gray sort of balance having those two still in the building?
It's an interesting one because I think there's a space for a traditional number 9 in that forward kind of group. Someone in the mold of a Kieran Bowie, a Mikola Kurevic, just 6'3", 6'4", another big player. Just to give options for going long, to sort of be a target, to be a kind of battering ram at times, in a way that I think they maybe thought Dane Scarlett would be. And I think they looked at his profile and thought, here's someone who's going to provide the kind of battering ram, the target man stuff, but also when we saw him, he held the ball up well, did have a number of shots, had to wait until the penultimate game of the season to actually get his goal. Turned out to be quite an important one on that night. And that's before you get to Owen Elding, Ante Schuto, Martin Boyle, and as you say, Thibaut Clichy. And I think there haven't been too many players at Hibs in recent seasons who've gone out on loan and then have come back and hit the ground running and been a roaring success. That's not to say Clichy won't or can't, but I think it's not often something that happens. I mean, just off the top of my head, Dylan Venti went out on loan, did well, and ended up getting a move off the back of it. Jair Tavares went out on loan, and I don't think really, I know he got injured, but I mean, he left shortly after that. We've seen other players go out on loan, and quite often, I think when you're a certain age and you're going out on loan, then it's almost like a bit of a death knell at a current club. I mean, off the top of my head, the last sort of senior player I can remember leaving Hibs on loan and then coming back and making an impact in the first team was Christian Doidge. He spent time at Kilmarnock and came back and still used, not perhaps as much as he had been, but he was still very much a squad player. He was starting games, he was coming off. I think he ended up with sort of 5 or 6 goals the season after being on loan. So it does happen, but it's a rarity. And I think, when we look at why Thibaut Clichy wasn't played, and I think a lot of fans were a bit mystified with it, because as you rightly point out with Randers, like when he starts games, he quite often scores goals. It's just this kind of, call it striker's instinct, but he did that at Livingston, I think, when he started in that League Cup game. He did it against Livingston in that 4-0 win at Easter Road.
Okay,
did it against Aberdeen in December, and I think it's the December, probably wasn't.
It was 30th December.
But it's that sort of, if the player's not doing all of the things that he's supposed to. And I know it seems silly because he's a striker, and they say, well, if he's scoring goals, then what of it?
That's his job.
But I mean, I think back to the number of times when he was playing games and the coaching staff were like constantly shouting at him, constantly trying to get him to do certain things.
Well, that Aberdeen game's a great exemplification of that. Like, I was in the West End, you could really see Gray and the staff sort of trying to get his attention, trying to get some message across. Like, I can't remember. Is he 24 or 25? He is still
25.
He's still a relatively young player, and it's
25 young.
I'm 24, and I would say that.
Are you a footballer?
No, I know I probably do a far worse job up front, as my seven-a-side career would dictate. But
I'd argue that he's not young in footballing terms. I think 25 is sort of almost. I think certainly for a striker, you're approaching kind of peak years.
But you also have to bear in mind that it's quite a big move for him. English isn't his first language. Trying to get that sort of level of connection with David Gray that early on, you could see there were teething issues. I think that's understandable. For me, I think the big problem with Cliche is you don't want to put everything down to the price tag, but he is your club record signing. You don't throw money like that around, sort of 1.5 million. It is a big outlay to spend on a player who goes out on loan for 6 months and then leaves straight away. I'd almost want to sort of, talking to Rasmus at least.
First name terms, interesting.
Talking to Rasmus, he didn't reply to my second message asking for further info about Thibaut Cliche, but play him alongside one of your sort of big physical traditional number nines, and kind of saw that at the start of the season. It worked at times, but it worked at times with Kieran Bowie.
Strongly disagree.
I'm trying to think.
I'm going to take you back to East End Park in January for that Scottish Cup game.
A lot of things went wrong that day.
And I don't think. I mean, that was part of I think that was part of the problem, that maybe he wasn't given as many chances. The other problem as well, because Hibs were in Europe and because he had like the League Cup, there wasn't an awful lot of room for bounce games, which would have been possibly the ideal sort of situation in which to say, right, we're going to play you alongside this player, we're going to play this formation, this system, we want you to do this. And just sort of seeing him in action, but in a game where like nothing's really at stake, and just sort of seeing how he fares, because there were a few times where we saw him play and you think, okay, yeah, he's got a shot on him. He is a handful for defenses. There were times you think, oh God, this is that, that turn or that pace. And that Livingston game is probably good. I think he could have had about 4 or 5 goals that game alone. And that maybe is part of the problem, that he got 1 goal, should have got more, could have got more. And it's just maybe, I don't know if he's like maybe a little bit more unrefined than Hibs maybe thought when they were bringing him in. And, as you say, 25, yeah, kind of still young. He did have that long-term injury when he was at Luzerne, but I think, when you look at somebody like Antti Schuto who's come in, I know, it's maybe been times he's maybe not looked particularly useful when he's been on from the start, but I don't think you can argue against some of those sub-appearances. There's a player who's about the same age who has come from probably a similar standard of league, Croatia, Swiss. Probably going to get all sorts of weird comments about that now, but that was a player who'd come in and he was sort of, I don't know, he just seemed to have a bit more about him. Whether that was sort of like harassing defenders, trying to goad them into making mistakes, just getting on the end of those balls, things like that. So, I'm not saying he's been perfect, but I just think maybe it's a little bit similar with Alassana, perhaps, that sometimes players just don't settle. I mean, Cliche he's the archetypal diminutive forward, I think. Like he's more physical than I think you maybe would give him credit for looking at him.
He's got an incredible jump.
He does have an incredible jump, but I just wonder whether he's been a little bit taken aback with the physicality of the Scottish game, and that's maybe sort of impacted his sort of effectiveness as well. And I think just that does seem to be the kind of buzzword, I suppose, of just the physicality of the Scottish game. Some players just can't come to terms with it for whatever reason. Some players thrive on it. I think Miguel Chaiwa, you sort of see opposition players bouncing off him,
and he's said as much in interviews that's something he really enjoys.
But he's also said like, oh, it's a lot more physical than he's sort of been used to. So there is that. It almost feels a bit like a kind of sink or swim approach. You bring in players in, and you can look at bringing in Chaiwa, and he was in the Swiss league. He was at Young Boys. They brought him in. He's been thriving. Klige's in the same league at Luzerne. They bring him in, and it's just not kind of worked out.
I would
And-
also like to retract my earlier comment, because while you've been talking, I've been going back in my head trying to remember a single other time where I could actually recall Thibaut Clige playing alongside Kieran Bowie. So I think if I may revise my earlier statement, I think I like the idea of him playing alongside a sort of big physical number. And I think that would work. I mean, it's almost like the Randers have that 4-4-1-1, and you almost play him in front, sort of off the shoulder of the last defender. And I think that's probably where he's best. And for me, I still think there's more to be seen. I wonder how he'll react to having been out on loan, sort of coming back, whether he'll have a point to prove, whether that'll help
He's
him.
absolutely got a point to prove. And I think it's...
But personally, sort of, not that he has a point to prove in general, but sort of whether how that affects him sort of feeling like he needs to come back and hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think from his point of view, though, he'll be looking at it and saying, the club spent a lot of money on me, because that wouldn't have escaped his notice. How can it? But so he'll be thinking, the club spent a lot of money on me. I scored some goals. I maybe didn't get as many chances as I would have liked. There's been a reason for that. So he comes back and he says, right, I'm going to prove, or I'm going to show that I deserve to be here. I'm going to, I don't know, maybe he already does, but I'm going to do extra. I'm going to come in on my day off. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to spend extra time working with the coaching staff to try and get that, try and get sort of, the sort of missing components from his game. Or it might just be a case of, it's not going to work out for me in Scotland. So, let's look for something elsewhere. And in which case it's been, I mean, you wouldn't criticize Hibs for trying. You look at the profile, you look at what he's done, look at his highlight reel. I know the highlight reels are always a dangerous way of scouting players or kind of getting an opinion about players, but you can see why Hibs would have looked at him and thought, there's a player we can work with, we can bring him in, we can make him better. And as you say, looked like a natural successor to Martin Boyle, that sort of like, fairly, quite sort of, well, we'll say diminutive again, that sort of diminutive forward, quite nippy, quite quick.
Physical as well.
Is Martin Boyle physical though?
Yes.
Is he?
Martin Boyle highlight reel of Hibs down to 10 men and 9 men in the Edinburgh Derby. Martin Boyle was physical.
So your sample is one game. Interesting.
I know, but
no, but he's not physical. Neither Clige nor Boyle are physical in the same way that, for example,
but I think
Kujarevich was or Bowie was.
I think he fits into that category that you said earlier of he's more physical than you would think.
Are we still talking about Martin Boyle or are we on Clige again?
We're talking about both of them.
Okay. But I think I can see why they brought him in. I can see why it would have made sense. The succession planning, which Hibs have been pretty bad at in recent seasons, when you look at how bloated the squad was and having to clear sort of players out to make way for sort of others. I think I remember at the time looking at it and saying, that's a sensible bit of business. You brought a player in from a league that you've brought players in from before, like Eli Yuan again came from the Swiss league, and that first season in green and white was really successful for him. Second as well, I think pretty good in terms of his numbers. And so you can understand why Hibs would go back to that league and say, well, we've had success from here before, and they obviously get it right with Chaiwa, Clige, the jury's still out. But it did look, to all intents and purposes, like a kind of successor to Boyle. If Boyle's still going to be there for this year, it comes into whether he's going to be starting every game, whether he's going to be playing as much, whether he's going to. I mean, we talk about the Dwight Gale role. I mean, maybe he is going to be taking on that role a little bit when you think about Owen Elding's just turned 20. Ante Schutel 25, Clige 25.
Yeah, sort of mentorship figure in the attack.
Because you forget just because of how long he's been there and the fact that he does have this, a little bit of a kind of class clown reputation, although obviously he's sort of shrugged off a bit of that to take on this leadership role. But you forget that Martin Boyle is 33 and he's been at the club a long time, so he knows what the standards are, he knows what's expected, he can pass that on to the younger players. So instead of trying to go out and find like another Dwight Gale-esque figure, because, I mean, for instance, Jamie Vardy's a free agent now. Just saying. But instead of going out and doing that and it's sort of, trying to fashion the right deal, trying to sort of, wages, etc. If you just say Martin Boyle is your kind of Dwight Gale-esque figure, then maybe there is room for Clige. Maybe there is room for Clige to learn from Boyle, to learn from the coaching staff, to kind of reinvent himself, if you like. But it's a lot of ifs.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the big thing, and it feels like he needs the time, he needs the opportunity, he needs the chance to sort of develop a partnership, maybe with Owen Elding. You mentioned maybe that would be an option, but time is a sort of luxury commodity in football.
Yeah,
And
I think he's been unfortunate in that the spell at Randers. I mean, it took a while to get going, just because I think there was kind of red tape issues, and
it was the sort of paperwork, and that gave Warren Cady the chance to sort of establish himself in the team before Cliche had even arrived.
Exactly, and then he's sort of struggling for game time here and there. Randers are obviously trying to battle relegation as well, and it's a difficult situation. It's a difficult kind of environment for him to be in when he's obviously trying to kind of kickstart his season, and he's not really getting the chance to do that. So maybe this season was just, or the second half of the season certainly was just a wee bit of a write-off for Cliche. But I mean, I'm sure we might hear from him at some point in the close season about how that loan went and how he's feeling about things at Hibs. But I think you wouldn't write him off entirely, but I do think an awful lot has to kind of fall into place and kind of go right for him to, I suppose, not really get a second chance, because that sort of implies something negative. But I think if he had if the coaching staff believe he had plenty of opportunities in the first half of the season just past and didn't take them, or wasn't doing what was required, or wasn't sort of listening to what was needed done, or wasn't able to do it for whatever reason, then that's when you maybe start having the conversations about, are we better trying to move him on and bring somebody else in? But every footballer is different. It could be that he comes back with this renewed vigor and he sort of hits the ground running in pre-season. He's a new man kind of thing, totally reinvented. You just never know.
He's found himself. It will be very interesting to see, and I think just with that sort of price tag over his head, it'd be a very good thing to see him come good and sort of come back with that renewed sense of, this is what I need to do, so hit the ground running in pre-season, and then Europe after that, and then sort of into the league season. It'll be interesting, and I hope he does get the opportunity to at least sort of have a crack at that, and I try and find a way to establish himself in the team, because he seems like a lovely guy, obviously very, very talented footballer. I think that would be absolutely to Hibs' benefit, but he did say it's a lot of ifs, and you don't want to be asking too many ifs in a season where it feels like Hibs really need to get it right. It's kind of 100%. Said sort of David Gray's third album. It does feel like he's not going to take too many chances on kind of letting players have a lot of time to impress him. He's going to want to hit the ground running as soon as possible, not have a slow start to the season. That's
exactly because he's running out of credit. I think the third place finish in his first season was maybe a little bit unexpected, and I think everything that went on last season, you do have that. It's always going to be sort of in that prism. It's always going to be compared to what happened elsewhere. The fair argument to make, but there does need to be, I think, the third season, he does need to start strongly. Europe needs to go well, however that looks, and there needs to be a better performance in the cup competitions as well. And they need to kind of start the league off with a bit more.
There almost can't be a worse performance in the cup competitions.
True.
Now that I've said that, the Mick McCarthy gif is coming out. It can
wrap it up.
We really hope it don't. Yeah, we're going to leave now.
Don't jinx it.
Before we say anything we'll regret. Thanks very much for tuning in. As ever, do please subscribe. It massively supports us. It's free to do. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and get notified for more podcast episodes like this. And follow us on all of our social media channels. They'll be listed somewhere down there, as well as a link to our website to read. Patrick, you've got an article coming out soon, basically summarizing most of what we've spoken about and sort of answering the recruitment questions as best we can. So a lot to look forward to before the new season kicks off very soon. Thanks for joining.